She arrived at dawn, suitcase wheels whispering against the airport tile, and the sun had not yet burned the dust from her hair. For a moment she stood in the sliding glass light and felt like a traveler between lives. One life stitched of night shifts and scrubs, the other a corridor of marble and protocol she could not yet imagine. She carried a stethoscope and a license. She carried a small, stubborn faith in what steady hands and a clear plan could do. He carried a crown she would never touch, and a grief that had hollowed out the man beneath it. She came to heal him. She did not know she was coming to lose herself. Emily Carter was 28, an American nurse with a laugh that arrived early and a habit of answering crisis with a checklist. She had held cold hands in ER bays and had learned how to find a pulse under noise and fear. The job at Al-Hadi Palace had been a contract, a 6-month placement to oversee convalescence after a fall that had taken the backbone from a public life. The ad read like many others: experienced critical care nurse, discretion required. It did not say anything about crowns, nor about the way silence could sit like a third person at a bedside. The palace received her before she saw the man. Fatima met her at the dates. Fatima, a woman whose smile was efficient as a pen and whose dress was embroidered with quiet competence. She moved through the rooms like someone who had been born between the curtains. She knew which tea met welcome, which hallway held the morning sun, which servant would bring the spare blanket without being asked. She had a way of folding information into a hand, offering it as both favor and instruction. "We are glad you are here," she said. And when Emily laughed in that small, sharp way that nurses do to keep their own bearings, Fatima's mouth stayed steady. "You will find things are different here," she added, "but the patient is grateful." Behind Fatima, the palace breathed. Fountains, marble like pale ribs, courtyards panted with citrus and roses whose petals were arranged as if by habit. The scent of mint tea rose with the steam. At the threshold of Samir Al-Hadi's suite, a woman bowed and placed a cup on a low table. The cup sat in a puddle of steam and a circle of reflection from the chandelier. Everything there was arranged to be beautiful on command. Samir was 52. The number mattered in ways that made Emily flush with a private, guilty arithmetic. 52 years of life and expectation, 28 years of bad coffee and saved shifts. They were not simply numbers, but social gravity. He moved with a cane now, and with the kind of reserve that kept the rooms small, an economy of expression learned in courts and countries that demanded him. When she first saw him, he sat at a window, a dark silhouette softened by morning.
His hands were a little shaky when he folded a newspaper. His eyes had the slow, dangerous shine of a man who had lost something that had taught his hands how to live. Their first exchanges were chess-like, small, polite, guarded. Her questions were professional, range of motion, sleep, appetite, and he answered like someone reading a script he no longer wanted to perform. "Pain is manageable," he said once, as if the phrase alone could keep the past from rising. "I sleep enough," he added. There was always this half-sentence, the one that said he had been awake the night his brother's laughter stopped, the night the palace had closed like a mouth. Emily was practical. She checked vitals with fingers that did not tremble, placed an oxygen carrier on the table like a companion, and suggested breathing exercises in an even voice. He listened with curiosity at first, then with a glance that was almost eager. "Teach me to breathe," he said one evening, voice like concrete softened by rain. I do not remember how. So she taught him. It began as work, a hand on a sternum to show the rise and fall, the counting like a benediction. Breath is a thing that can be taught, she believed. It was mechanical and honest, a small machine in the ribcage that required only insistence. She counted for him until he could count for himself. When, weeks later, she found him bowing his head in a garden, awake to a sunset he had not watched in months, the ripple of a smile at the corner of his mouth was not merely gratitude. Even then, it looked like something she had not expected to want, the knowledge that her presence could remold how grief arranged a life. The palace air around him thinned. For once he laughed with a sound that did not sound like a concession. Fatima watched these shifts with the cool, patient gaze of someone who measured risks like a homemaker measures spices, never too much, never too little. "He responds to routines," she said the first time she saw Emily pacing the suite at midnight, one hand on his shoulder, checking his pulse. "Routines are how you will keep him. But remember, Miss Carter, the palace keeps its habits also." There was a clause in Fatima's voice that Emily could not read yet, a ledger of caution attached to the kindness. Rashid was visible in absence at first, the brother's shadow in the corridors, a man who managed the room's boundaries with an internalized law. He was younger than his sibling by only a few years, But where Samir's pain softened him, Rashid's fear hardened into vigilance. He met Emily once in the council room when she was quarter-turned from the light, and he summed up his position with a single, courteous question. Are you here to help him or to become part of the life that isolates him? There was no malice in it, only a blunt desire to hold the palace's line. In his presence, Emily felt, for the first time, the socially charged weight of her tiny body in that wide household.
Balls of absurdity were thrown between them and caught, early and often. Emily would set a thermometer, and Samir would remark in a dry voice that it was the first time anyone had insisted on the temperature of his tea. He called the staff by their positions first, and then by their names later, as if winning trust were a sport and not an exchange. Temperatures are useful, Emily said once, setting a cup down. You do not want your tea hotter than your grief. He smiled, and the smile was like sunlight hitting turned glass, unexpected, bright, and sharp. He relied on her competence. In the small hours, when the palace slept and the fountain sounded like old things remembering, she became his lifeline. He asked for her because when fear hit, he did not want the polished caution of courtiers. He wanted a hand that smelled of hospital soap rather than protocol. He wanted someone who would hold the edge steady because it would be held, not because there was a law that said it must be. The first midnight came without warning. Emily woke to movement in the dark room, the hush of shoes, the small rustle of someone looking for windows. Samir had sat up, his breathing jagged as if his ribs did not remember their instructions. His fingers fisted the bedspread. He told her later that the room had been full of voices, echoes, she supposed, of things he could not catch. It is chest tightness and the world narrows, he said, voice raw, like drowning on dry land. She slid out from the linen and sat at the edge of his bed, the hospital reflex kicking in. Calm, firm hands, measured voice. She knelt and took his wrist, feeling the sprint of pulse, and she put a palm against his sternum to remind it how to expand. Breathe with me, she told him, in that low, professional tone she used to argue doctors into slow decisions. In for 4. Hold. Out for 6. They breathed until his hands unclenched and the palms relaxed. He watched her face, searching for an anchor that belonged to his life as much as it did to hers. When the panic ebbed, their fingers lingered. That night the palace felt close, 2 people in a cavern of velvet and marble, 2 hearts beating enough for a small truce. A week later, Emily found the bottle. She was searching the bedside drawer for a spare thermometer and instead found a pill bottle, unlabeled, tucked behind a stack of glossy family photographs. The bottle had a white cap and a foreign pharmacy stamp. Her first thought was professional. Unsupervised medication is a risk, and the risk is a patient's life. Her fingers tightened. She took the bottle into the light. The pills were small and round. The number was more than she expected. When she confronted Samir in the garden with the bottle cupped in her palm, he did not try to hide. He moved with the fatigued honesty of someone who had been living with a secret too long to dress it. They were for the nights, he said.
They flatten the edges, but then you wake like you have been sleeping someone else's time. There was no defensiveness, only a tired precision in the sentence. He did not ask her to throw them away. He looked at her like someone who needed help deciding whether to keep ghosting his nights with sedatives or to learn breathing again. The rule book inside her head said she should log it, call Dr. Kamal, conduct a formal review. The other book, the one written in the margins, where compassion and practicality make messy decisions, said she should remove the immediate hazard and then find counsel. She took the bottle down to the basin in a small kitchen staff area Fatima had shown her. The water's steam blurred her fingers as she crushed the pills and flushed them. It felt like a trespass and like mercy at once. She did not write a report that night. She told herself she would the next day. When she told Dr. Kamal, he listened with the wariness of a clinician who had seen small acts become habit. "You did what you thought was best in the moment," he said eventually, and the sentence held the relief of an approval and the ire of implicit rebuke. "We must be careful. Medication management is both safety and record. If you discard without consulting the team, you weaken us as practitioners. But I also understand the calculus of a midnight decision." He did not condemn her. He reminded her of boundaries. Those boundaries, he said, were there to protect patients and staff from entanglement. The word entanglement lingered in the room like a dropped fork. Neither of them wanted to define who might be tangled. The palace's formality was not only aesthetic, it was a lattice work that kept relationships neat, tidy, and legible. Each title, each tea ritual, each ceremonial step existed to make sense of who belonged where. Emily, who had lived in institutions where titles were functional rather than ceremonial, found the palace's language of belonging both intoxicating and claustrophobic. To the staff, she was ambiguous, competent and foreign, necessary and disruptive. To the council, she was a variable in an equation that could be solved only with time and supervision. Rashid's attention, when finally turned fully toward her, arrived as a slow tightening. He did not accuse her. He asked questions that were small and surgical. "Who authorized that you stay late 2 nights last week?" he inquired once over a formal tea, voice like a measuring line. "What is your arrangement with him?" His tone was not merely protective of his brother. It was protective of an institutional memory that feared improvised bonds. There was fear in his questions, yes, fear that a man who had lost so much could be swept into something that would undo him further. But there was also fear for the palace itself, which had to navigate the world with a certain predictability. "The world watches these things closely," Rashid said, as if reciting a law.
Emily answered with the blunt clarity of someone trained to triage. "I stay because he needs someone who will make sure he breathes when he cannot remember to," she said. "I'm not here to be rescued by a title, nor to rescue a title. I'm here to do a job." Rashid's jaw tightened. "Sometimes a job becomes a life," he said. He was not malicious. He meant the observation as a warning. On the surface, Samir's gratitude was simple. Steadiness, someone who could anchor his sleeping, someone who could keep him from sliding deeper into sedation or dangerous invention. But gratitude did not exist in a vacuum. It became an obligation before anyone called it that, a force with leverage in the rooms and gardens where power learned to speak without shouting. The more she was needed, the more she was noticed. The more she was noticed, the more fragile the lattice around her felt. Small acts began to shape a new face of Emily's day. She began to sleep in a small guest wing more nights than not, one quiet, compromising decision after another that read as devotion in the palace gossip and as overcommitment by her own friends back home. Her emails came less often. Interviews she had lined up in the States got pushed for another month. She told herself she was meant to be here. She told herself it was temporary. 6 months, the contract said. When asked to rest, she laughed and called it practical. There were times when the palace rewarded what it took. Samir's recovery was visible. He walked farther, joked more, attended a dinner and did not leave early. The staff rearranged to fit his rhythm. The palace seemed to breathe with him. The garden bloomed, and someone pruned a rosebush into a shape that reminded Emily of the time she had spent arranging IV lines into orderly bays. She took pride in the small triumphs. A day without sedation, laughter in the dining room, his fingers finding hers in the dark and holding on like an anchor. But the palace's public nature meant private things curdled into commentary. A visiting cousin noted Emily's ability to laugh at his jokes and filed it away as a domestic curiosity. A breakfast with a council member yielded a tightening in Rashid's face, and that tightening began to map the palace's future choices. "We cannot have unregulated attachments," one councilman told Samir gently, the tone of a man balancing affection with policy. "Everyone's reputation matters." The first time Samir invited Emily to attend a ceremony as his guest in a public seating, the air smelled like citrus and impending rain. The room was full of cameras, official recorders and smartphones, and when she took her seat beside him, Emily felt like paper in a ledger she had not seen until the ink dried. People watched. They watched with the curiosity reserved for private wounds displayed in public light. It should have been a simple honor. He had survived the crisis of his spine, and his grief was not a monolith. He was a man who enjoyed being tended, and to whom tending meant being seen. He turned to her at one point during the ceremony and mouthed something private, the shape of which she could not read across chandeliers and men in suits. When the crowd broke into applause, she felt applause fall like a net at her feet. The moment that turned the private into an irreversible thing arrived at an airport, and it arrived with the force of theatrical weather. He had agreed to go to a memorial in another city, and the palace's motorcade had reduced the trip to something that looked like a state's small procession. Emily's task was simple: accompany him and ensure that travel did not unspool the fragile threads of health they had rewoven. She did not expect ceremony at an airport. People had a way of making meaning from movement, and at that terminal, a movement became a statement. Cameras clustered like flowers at a funeral, intent and swelling. Rashid watched from a distance with eyes that held a restraint like a rope.
Samir, perhaps tired of being protected into loneliness, perhaps moved by a freedom that had surfaced in his chest, took Emily's hand in front of those lenses. The gesture was small. It turned into something else when he stepped forward, and, in a voice that pulled small crowds and coaxed sound out of waiting reporters, said her name. "You were the person who taught me to breathe again," he said. The words landed like prayer. He spoke of nights when the dark had weight, and of how she had been steady. He spoke of gratitude and a life now being redrawn. Then, with a flourish that belonged to a man who had not been alone in making public things for a long time, he made an offer, not an immediate contract, not a legal pronouncement, but a declaration that shifted the axis of her life. Would she remain, not merely as a nurse, but as someone who belonged at his side? It was the kind of gesture that looked romantic in photographs and decisive in headlines. People applauded, some wept, others recorded on their phones, the circle of light from their screens like a second moon. Emily felt the cameras like heat on the back of her neck, felt Rashid's posture change, noticed Fasina's hand tense at her side. For a breath she was proud that healing had looked like this in public, like a success story whose images would travel further than the day itself. Then the applause receded and the air became dense with implication. Emily could have refused. In the crowd's aftersmile, with the camera still hungrily blinking, she felt the chance to say no. She thought of the contract, she thought of the nurse's oath she kept somewhere inside her. She thought of the small certain life she would lose if she said yes, but she also saw his face, the softening of pain into trust, the gratitude of a man who had not been given a hand like hers in years.
She weighed the ledger, the lives she could save, the patient who could heal enough to live, versus the life she might leave behind. She said yes. Not in a bombshell, not shouted into microphones like some soap opera cadenced for the cameras. She said yes in a voice that sounded like a promise. "I won't leave," she said. It was not a legal vow. It was an attempt at honesty in a world where honesty and headlines braided into new meanings. Samir smiled then, with something like relief, like someone who had been offered a bridge. Rashid's face did not change, as if loss would be transformed by emotion. He was quiet, and then he took Samir's arm, guiding him past the cluster of microphones. He did not speak to Emily beyond a curt, "We will make arrangements," which was saying far more than it gave. Fatima remained close, her presence steady as a knife kept in a drawer, useful, necessary, and always ready. The photographs the next morning told a story that would follow Emily. They showed her at his side in the VIP lounge, hand on his for a beat too long for some. The captions speculated on titles and futures. The palace staffers told stories in corridors, some with the warm color of affection, some with the grayed edge of worry. The council convened later that week in a room that smelled faintly of lemon oil and old paper. Rashid called Emily in for a private talk before that council. He was a man who preferred a straight line to a spiral. He told her that things would be different now. "Public recognition changes the stakes," he said. He did not accuse, he instructed. "You will be subject to protocols we have in place when household relationships change. There will be committees, there will be expectations. You must be prepared for them." Emily, who had already spent nights with his hand in hers, who had flushed with the near brilliance of being needed, felt the phrase, "prepared for them," like a lock closing softly. It sounded practical. It sounded like policy. It sounded like the architecture of an entirely new life. When she asked, quietly, if her nursing practice would continue in the public health clinic she had once imagined opening with Samir's support, Rashid's answer was careful. "You will be allowed activities that will reflect well on the household. You will not, however, be permitted to act independently if it compromises state dignity." It was framed as a balance, a model of dignity versus the dangers of caprice. But for Emily, it translated into a ledger that removed options, independent practice, a career trajectory, the small rebellions that had defined her for years. She felt the loss as a chill beneath the palm, unexpected and immediate. That night, sitting alone in the guest wing, her passport open on the bedside table like a small removable life, she thought of counting breaths. She thought of the pills she had crushed in a basin, and the way she had chosen mercy over procedure.
She thought of the word belonging, like an accusation and a blessing stitched into one seam. She had chosen to stay, to say yes in a blurred terminal under camera lights, and the act had already begun to rewrite the ledger of power around her. A small part of her told herself she would be okay. Eight of the edges of her past life felt the metal of a cage in the way arrangements were being called protocol. The palace loved the shape of ritual. It did not always love the people who entered its rituals. Emily had opted into an order with rules she had not yet fully read. She slept poorly and woke with a small resolve
to make certain things clear. In the morning, she told Fatima she needed to speak to Dr. Kamal about documenting her continued responsibilities. Fatima nodded, like someone who could assess the likelihood of a plan and its vulnerabilities. Do not burn bridges without building new ones, she advised. It was practical counsel. It was also an early map of how someone in Emily's position could be slowly contained without the appearance of force. Outside, the roses were pruned into precise halves, half-circle echoes of the courtyard's symmetry. The air smelled of citrus and steam, and the faintly medicinal scent of antiseptic, a place where tenderness and governance breathed in the same line. Samir walked through the garden that afternoon with a cane that was both support and symbol. He looked at the roses with the concentration of someone who had not wanted beauty for a long time, but was trying on appreciation like new shoes. They strolled together, and for a while the world felt simple, a patient and his nurse becoming something like friends, then more. He thanked her again for staying. She smiled and told herself she had not decided anything irreversible. He talked of opening a clinic in the palace grounds, of offering free visits to workers and staff. The plan sounded as if it existed to keep both of them safe, him from his old ghosts and her from losing professional identity. When Samir spoke, his voice steadied in ways it had not months earlier. He was grateful and he was earnest, a combination that made Emily's chest ache with the human compulsion to do well for people who trusted you. When the court photographer sent a discreet album later that week, pictures of them walking beneath the oranges, someone in the staff whispered, "See how well he has recovered." Another staffer said, half in awe, "She has given him breath back." Those words flattered and scared Emily in equal measure. Breath had been her first duty. Now breath had become a currency. Despite the settling sense of purpose, there were small betrayals embedded in daily life. Colleagues Emily had come to rely on found reasons not to visit, to move around the palace with the polite distance that czars of etiquette keep when a life is changing.
The friends she texted in the evenings replied with gifts and emojis and plans she never quite could accept. They were kind, but kindness dissolved like sugar when heat hit it. Her mother called more than once to tell her she sounded tired. Emily smiled into the phone and lied, saying she was fine. At a council meeting that followed the airport spectacle, they discussed public image in terms of numbers and charted expectations in a language Emily did not understand. She sat quietly at the edge of a room where men and women in tailored suits balanced loyalty and optics. Rashid spoke in short, precise sentences that were a mapping of how the palace would respond to any hint of scandal. The council did not frame their actions as coercion, they framed them as preservation. "We must ensure stability," one member said. "Unregulated attachments become vulnerabilities." She left that room feeling watched, not because someone had said it directly, but because the lattice around her was rearranging without her consent. She had said yes to a man who had been in pain and had given him back a shape. In return, her life was already being drawn into margins she had not expected. There were moments, small, private, incandescent, where the exchange of care felt like an honest, mutual return. He would bring her flowers from the garden with the embarrassed self-consciousness of a man relearning intimacy. Once he gifted her a small white bouquet, and she wept alone in the guest kitchen because she did not know whether she was crying from gratitude or the shock of being the recipient of a ritual she had not ever asked to be measured by. Fatima watched the two of them sometimes with a face that suggested possible allegiance and possible concern. "You will learn the rhythms," she told Emily once over a tray of mint tea, "but you must also learn to protect yourself in the same way you protect others." Her voice was both ally and mirror. Emily promised herself she would be vigilant. The public loved a story of healing. The palace loved a story of stability restored. The courtyard gardeners loved a face that came by more often and greeted them by name. The press loved a headline that suggested romance had bridged a gap. Emily, who had been a species of rescuer all her adult life, welcomed the warmth of being needed. She did not at first see that the warmth could calcify into ownership. On a late evening, in the hush between his late calls and the staff's minimum movements, Samir said something that stopped her like a hand on the back of the throat. "I am not a young man," he murmured, almost to himself. The word simple is a statement of fact. "I know I cannot give you all the things that are considered ordinary for a person of 28. His hand found hers under the table. There was no plea in his voice. There was only truth and a careful opening of a wound. "If you stay, I want you to understand fully what that means." Emily squeezed back, because she wanted to, because the human reciprocity of closeness is a thing that lives in muscle memory. But she also heard in his sentence the outline of the damage yet to come, that the age difference was more than the sum of years.
It carried the possibility of a life rearranged around a man with a history and a name and an empire of expectations. She answered then with the tired, earnest optimism that had carried her through long shifts. "I know the risks," she said, "but I believe in this work. I believe we can find balance." He looked at her with a tenderness so deep it made her feel raw. "I am grateful," he said, "and I will not take this lightly." But gratitude is not a contract, neither is a promise. The palace had been built to turn private promises into social obligations, to fold affection into protocols that would be defended by men like Rashid in council rooms. Emily understood that on a level of policy, but she still thought the center of things could be human. That belief, small and stubborn, was enough to move her to say yes before she fully read the ledger. When dawn lighted the marble fountains the morning after the airport, Emily watched a courier deliver a small stack of newspapers to the steps. The headlines had already turned her personal choice into public gossip. The story praised the royal's recovery and lauded the nurse as a figure of devotion. She left the paper on the bench and walked to the citrus trees. A lemon tree released a fragrance into the air that felt at once nourishing and pungent with warning. She counted breaths for a long time then, filling the morning with the slow economy it required. She had come to heal him. The healing was real. So was the cost forming quietly around her like a slow tide. Would you have stayed to help someone who could never give you the same life? Tell us in the comments. The months that followed folded like fine paper, easy to crease, hard to smooth again. Samir's recovery was a ledger of small returns, longer walks along the shaded colonnades, a steady hand on the brass banister, the way he could sit through a long conversation without vanishing into the private grief that had been his companion. Emily counted those improvements the way she had counted breaths in the dark, deliberately, like progress could be stacked and measured. The palace rewarded the arithmetic. Staff whispered about the nurse who repaired a prince. The public cheered photographs showing a man no longer stooped by sorrow. And yet, as the public glow grew, the private margins around Emily tightened. Rashid and the council instituted a 3-month trial, an arrangement dressed in institutional language, integration period, compatibility assessment, household alignment. On paper, it looked sensible. Clear responsibilities for public roles, oversight on engagements, scheduled appearances where Emily would represent charitable work nominally connected to healthcare.
Samir signed the documents with a careful hand and a face that suggested he believed the paperwork could act as armor. Emily read the clauses in an office that smelled faintly of lemon oil and paper glue. She was practical. She understood the palace needed predictability. But the clauses thinned the space where she had imagined herself continued as both clinician and companion. Her license would remain valid, they said, but her ability to practice independently, outside the house and without palace authorization, would be subject to review. "This is standard protocol," Dr. Kamal said when she came to him later, his fingers paired around a mug of tea that had gone cold. "The line is between public duty and private practice. It is not personal." She believed him because he was a doctor, and doctors have the authority to make complex tolerances seem humane. Still, she felt the slow erosion. Invitations to speak at conferences were postponed until protocol considerations were clarified. A research grant she'd hoped to use for a community clinic in her hometown had to be deferred because any public association with the palace now required approvals that moved at the speed of council. Samir tried to be the counterweight. He sat with her in the study and described his hope for a small clinic on palace grounds that would offer free hours for staff, seasonal health drives for laborers, and when he spoke fast with the bright conviction he used to make promises public, he said he would fund it. "We will imagine it together," he told her, tracing the shape of a plan with a fingertip on the wood table. He looked younger in those moments, 10 years erased by the attention of purpose. She believed him because she wanted to. She believed him because he had taught her what it was to breathe again. Fatima became the quiet architect who tried to wedge options into impossible corners. "We can find places for both your oath and the house's needs," she said, pouring steaming mint tea into 2 cups with the ceremony of someone threading a needle through a seam. "But you must also learn to measure when to step back." Emily took comfort in Fatima's hassle, and in the evenings the two would walk the gardens while Samir practiced steps with a cane he now leaned upon less. Fatima's counsel always came with a caveat: protect yourself as much as you protect others, and the caveat was beginning to feel less like advice and more like an instruction manual for survival. There were small triumphs. They opened a summer clinic in the service wing, a small room where palace staff could receive basic care.
Emily helped set the schedule, trained attendants, and ran an inaugural day when she cut a ribbon, and the press, tactful this time, photographed her handing out bandages. The headlines read with the same easy satisfaction palace stories often enjoy: Royal Recovery spurs Liwa Health Initiative.
On the surface, the clinic looked like the solution she had imagined. In practice, it was undercut with stipulations. The clinic would run under palace supervision, funding controlled by a committee, and any outreach to outside bodies required clearance. Her name was there in the program, but the range of her reach was narrower than she had expected. The public events were intoxicating and dangerous at once. With every ribbon cut, with every speech the photographers lingered over, Samir's gratitude swelled into expectation. People began to talk about honorary titles. Cousins and emissaries started to visit with small gifts wrapped in ceremonial cloths. The palace calendar filled with functions where she was to be present, a word whose soft syllables masked its capacity to occupy hours and attention. Slowly, the hours she could assign to genuine clinical work dwindled into appearances, a smile here, a console there. Emily tried to keep a balance. She negotiated for weekend hours at the clinic, for opportunities to train staff without public frills, for an assistant who could manage supplies. But any request that implied autonomy, funds held independently, outreach beyond palace borders, met a wall that looked like concern but functioned as a bind. Rashid framed his refusals as stewardship. "Reputation is not simply image," he said once, leaning on the balcony that overlooked the citrus grove. "It is protection. If the household's actions are not consistent with its position, the consequences are not personal, they are collective." The word collective hovered over Emily like a verdict. Even Samir's warmth began to carry an unspoken ledger. When he asked her to cancel plans because a foreign delegation had arrived and he wanted her presence, she complied, and the compliance became evidence in the palace files that she belonged now to the rhythm of the household. She had said yes in the airport, and each subsequent yes set another seal. At night she dreamt in meditative fragments, a pair of hands holding a stethoscope, then a cup of tea cooling into a ring on polished marble, then a child she did not yet know pressing a small hand into hers. The brush of motherhood hovered like possibility, a prospect that filled and complicated everything. The day she learned she was pregnant, the news came like a double-edged bloom. Samir's joy was immediate and unguarded. He cried when she told him, his eyes wet and luminous in a way Emily had only seen when he spoke of the brother he'd lost. He pressed a forehead to hers and said, "We will be careful," in a voice that trembled like the fragile strings of a cello. Fatima, who had been a steady yes in so many things, exhaled with a softness that read as relief. Dr. Kamal offered cautious congratulations. He arranged for an initial prenatal visit that afternoon, his manner that of a clinician suddenly very invested in 2 lives.
The palace framed the pregnancy as a restoration narrative. A man healed enough to begin a family, a nurse turned partner bringing life into a household. The press called the baby a sign of continuity, and the council quietly restructured roles to reflect the new reality. Where the pregnancy should have been exclusively a private joy, it threaded through the palace's public life like a golden ribbon. The clinic's modest hours expanded into ceremonial contributions, appearances at maternal health panels, photo ops with expectant mothers from staff. Samir wanted to ensure their child would inherit stability. Rashid wanted to ensure lineage and reputation followed protocol. Both desires had the curious effect of shrinking the space where Emily's private choices lived. Early on, Emily tried to hold both halves of her life tight. She insisted on attending to clinical duties, as long as Dr. Kamal supported her. She continued breathing exercises with Samir in the late hours, and in daylight she educated staff about prenatal care. But the pattern hardens. Invitations to internalize palace life grew. Friends from her previous life, colleagues, her mother, received fewer calls, and the time zones between them became a gulf. When she tore a ligament during a fall in the garden, an uneventful misstep, the healing was managed within the palace. There was no need to call an outside surgeon. The internal mechanism saw to that. It was efficient. It was also another seam stitched closed. She felt with a pinch of humor and a quiet collapse of stubbornness that she was being remade into an image that pleased the palace and the public. She performed the smiling companion at dinners. She fielded questions from reporters in the manicured parlor, framing answers as if they were small therapeutic interventions. "We're focusing on staff health," she would say, and then offer a line about family and community. People nodded and applauded the narrative. Healing had produced new life and a new purpose. Meanwhile, invitations from outside, conferences, boards, peers wanting her to consult,
were filtered through the palace's mechanisms. Approval took weeks, sometimes it never came. Under the lacquer of ceremony, small violences accumulated that were not labeled as such. Protocols that once sounded like practical guardrails began to feel like fences. Her movements required sign-offs for travel beyond the palace grounds. Her phone was rarely left unattended. It came with an assumed audience that made private conversations require scheduling. At times, Samir noticed and would say apologetically, "I don't mean to clip your wings," as if his love could be the cause of constriction, not a symptom of larger forces. She had not expected that love could be the vehicle of containment. She had expected kindness, gratitude, a life shaped around mutual care. She did not expect a palace to convert that care into a script that limited her capacities.
The calamity was not a single violent act, but the slow accrual of limits that day by day reapplied a different life to her like a tailored suit. It fit neatly, imposed a silhouette, and slowly scrubbed away the ragged edges of the Emily who had once chosen first to be a clinician. Small symbolic acts began to take on weight. Samir presented her with a ring one evening in a private sitting, not as a demand, but as an offering, the older man's way of phrasing permanence. She accepted because she loved him, and because the gesture had the gravity of a promise from someone who had been so broken. The ring changed how others addressed her. Aloud, people began to refer to her as consort in private conversation, then with more confidence in quarters where she could hear. Once, at a staff meal, a junior nurse nodded at her and said softly, "You're one of them now," meaning the household. That phrase lodged in her throat. She was one of them, which also meant one of theirs. The palace's corridors, once an environment of careful, warm invitation, began to look like a labyrinth that measured days by duty. She found herself rehearsing responses. Where she once entered rooms to give clinical direction, she now often stood to be courteous and deferential to committees discussing public image. Rashid's interventions became more structural. He had members on boards, friends among the council, and a network that turned social capital into policy. He never raised his voice at her. He used procedure and the language of protection to accomplish what a shouting argument might have made visible. It was a quieter force, but no less effective. Emily attempted to push back gently. She spoke to Samir about the clinic's autonomy. She suggested remote mentoring with a training program she had helped design in the States. She drafted a proposal outlining how independent oversight would protect both the clinic's integrity and the palace's dignity. Samir listened, often with love and a quiet frustration. "We will do it," he would say. "In time. We will do it when the council is ready." In time is a phrase that contains both hope and a slowly closing door. Her friends back home began asking about the child, about her mother, about return flights. Emily promised she would visit in the winter. She inserted soft lies into the string of her life, saying things like, "You should see him laugh now," because the truth, that she felt boxed in by the very love she had offered, felt unbearable to voice. It was easier to tell people that nothing had changed, to keep the image of a success story intact. It hurt in a way that was at once tender and corrosive. The turning point arrived not in a single explosive public falling out, but in a day that would later read like a hinge in a story about slow losses. The council required Samir to sign a letter that codified Emily's public role.
They framed it as standard housekeeping, clarifying duties, formalizing public appearances, and ensuring the palace's reputation. But there were clauses that referred to household priorities overriding external commitments, to access to external funding being mediated through palace structures, and to any public statements made on behalf of household causes being approved by the communications office. The language was reasonable, and it was a contract that recentered authority in a way that she could feel like a thread being pulled through cloth. She read it in Fatima's office, the paper trembling a little in her hands, a flutter of newsprint in a world that demanded permanence. Fatima watched her with a face that had the tired compassion of someone who had watched this story a dozen ways before. "They will guard you," Fatima said. "They will guard the child, and in guarding they will ask for certain things in return." "What things?" Emily asked. She heard in her voice the small panic she had been training herself to ignore. "Can't he just say no?" Fatima set the cup down with a precise slap. "He can say no," she said, "but he wants to say yes to the household as well. You must decide where your line is." Emily tried to draw a line that kept both her ministry and her own integrity intact. She tried bargaining, compromise, the kind of small diplomacy that keeps marriages alive. But Rashid's maneuvers were sophisticated. He had allies in the council who argued that anything resembling independent agency could invite scandal or confusion at the line of succession. They did not talk of Emily's well-being as its own metric. They spoke instead of optics, stability, and the precedent her autonomous clinic might set. The palace's pressure did not look like an iron fist. It looked like a polite hand directing a guest to an arranged seat.
That subtlety made it harder to protest. She found herself repeatedly saying yes to requests that filled her schedule with representation duties and emptied her calendar of hands-on care. Each concession felt small. Each small concession added to a pile that would eventually become a mountain of reliance on palace structures. When the child was born, the world described it as a triumph. Samir sat in a polished chair and wept at the first cry. Emily held the baby and felt terror and a fierce, incandescent love so sharp it startled her. The child was a small, breathing thing that made sound like a bell. She named the infant in private, a name that resonated with both cultures, an offering she made for the life she hoped to preserve between two worlds. Yet motherhood amplified the constraints. There were midwives from the palace, staff who were expected to be present at the breast and the feeding. Officials recommended a pace and a schedule for visits. The infant's pictures were curated and then widely released. Each image came with narrative tags that framed their family as an emblem of restoration.
People wrote think pieces about the nurse who had become a mother to a royal line. Some called her modern, others called her miraculous. The language of miraculous made Emily flinch. She did not feel miraculous. She felt muffled, as if applause had been pressed against her face like a pad and had left her breathless. Sleep became a scarce currency again. The palace, for all its comforts, also contained watchers who measured time in a way a hospital emergency room does. Tight efficiencies, schedules for feedings, visitors' hours. Samir struggled with his health in waves of small slips. He would rise at odd hours, his breath shaky. Emily learned to soothe him and to soothe the baby simultaneously, murmuring rhythms she had learned in the months before the child existed. She became an anchor again, but the anchor was now also an emblem. The more she did for the household, the more the household relied on her doing exactly that. The more the household relied on her, the less allowance they made for her to be anything else. The pressures intensified 2 years on. What had been a 5-year vision chipped away into present obligations. The clinic's limited hours were maintained, but the autonomy she had dreamed of, mobile health units, independent staff training workshops across neighboring communities, required sign-offs that arrived late or not at all. Partners who would have collaborated with her in the States hesitated when they learned of the palace's involvement. The committee appointed to oversee the clinic's operations prioritized palace interests, inviting donors whose generosity came with sponsorship clauses. Her role was now to embody palace benevolence. Her capacity to exercise independent clinical judgment on outside bodies was curtailed in acts cleverly framed as protection. On a humid afternoon, a young woman from a nearby village came to the palace requesting aid. The attendants had brought her in because she had been told that the clinic helped workers. Emily wanted to see her, wanted to examine, to understand, to advise. But the communications office had insisted that any outreach be carefully scheduled and that the woman's visit had to be approved. They had arranged an appearance later that week as a community outreach event. Emily argued that a delay could change the woman's condition. Rashid, hearing of the exchange, intervened with a gentle, final tone. "We must maintain order. There are protocols to ensure integrity." The woman went home with a pamphlet and a promise of a later appointment. That night, Emily could not sleep. She walked the marble corridors, cold, echoing, lined with portraits who watched with painted eyes, and thought about the young mother who could not wait for processed benevolence. She realized in a flash how the palace's mechanisms turned urgency into ceremony. When care required speed, the palace offered protocol. Where people needed improvised mercy, the palace preferred planned compassion.
Her frustration flared into resentment, not because she thought Samir wanted to control her, but because the machinery around him insisted upon containment that turned care into image. She began to speak less, to measure tone, to hold small truths in the back of her mouth and swallow them at formal dinners. In one of those dinners, someone raised a question about a potential public health partnership with an international NGO. Emily volunteered, after 2 drinks, feeling a courage that had been soaked in warm wine, to speak to the NGO leaders privately. The room quieted then, not in friendly interest, but in a kind of protocol of assessment. Rashid's jaw set like a hinge. "You must route that through the committee," he said later, quietly, and the sentence closed discussion. The NGO met with the committee and returned with a list of demands that would have required her to yield the clinic's policy to Palace Council. The project dissolved. Emily learned to watch real work slip through the fingers of public good because of an institution aligning its risk aversion. Her identity splintered quietly. She still applied the same clinical touch, the pulse checks, the breathing counts, but often, after a shift of representation, she would sit alone and feel a small buzzing absence in her chest.
It was as if the person who had been an independent clinician had been drained into a series of roles that fit a palace narrative. The more people thanked her in public, the less they asked how she was. The pressure inside the house was not all from the council. Friends she had made within the staff were reassigned. Promotions were handed to those who fit the new shapes. Some resented her, seeing her as the reason their time had altered. Others were affectionate but distant, wary of attachment that could be read as collusion. Fatima remained a presence, solid, wary, loyal. She gave Emily small relics, a little silk handkerchief, a pressed flower from the garden. Once, leaving the handkerchief in a drawer, Emily found the petals stiffened into a brittle shape, beautiful and dead. The image became a private metaphor, beauty preserved, but no longer blooming. The fissure widened when a rumor circulated about the clinic's funding. An external donor alleged lack of transparency, an accusation born as much of confusion as of deliberate testing. The committee called an emergency review. Samir was combative in meetings, his temper rising with a tired ferocity that seemed to surprise even him. He defended the clinic and Emily with a passion that made some of the council applaud and others recoil. Rashid insisted on compliance, and Emily found herself before a room of officials who spoke in the language of account ledgers, their compassion catalogued into checks and balances. "I did everything by the book," she said softly. Her voice sounded thin in the council chamber, the marble swallowing it. Dr. Kamal stood and vouched for her clinical competence.
Fatima slid a dossier of the clinic's logs across the table. Yet the committee's concern had a momentum that could not be undone by competence. It insisted on procedure, not intention. In the months after the hearing, a series of restrictions were implemented, not overtly punitive, but efficient in effect. External partnerships were curtailed. The clinic's fundraising channel was moved to an internal account with oversight. She could still treat patients within a defined radius, but her capacity to lead independent projects was limited. Samir wrote to donors on her behalf, signed letters he thought would protect her. "We will rebuild carefully," he told her in the evening, fingers finding hers across the table. "We will not let other people set the story." She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that the palace's nervous protections were a necessary price for safety. But she knew, in the small, deep places where nerves kept records, how such care could calcify. Power, she learned, seldom relinquishes the very thing it claims to protect. The final trace of her identity that disappeared came nearly imperceptibly. It was not a dramatic dismissal, it was an administrative reclassification. Her title changed in official documents from clinical coordinator to household health envoy. It was a semantic shiver that moved through the staff like a rumor. Where once she had been responsible for triage protocols, now she was responsible for ceremonial maternal health events. Her phone numbers were rerouted. Invitations from professional boards began to list her as honorary rather than active. She realized with a cold clarity that the life she had trained for, the life she had promised herself, had been legislated away in increments. The recognition that she had been moved from practitioner to emblem fractured something inside her. She began to have panic attacks again. The same tightening of chest, the narrowing of world, the sensation of drowning on dry land. The palace had ways to manage such things. A private physician, a quiet room, breathing techniques practiced again and again until her body was a list of commands. She practiced breathing with the same mechanical calm she had taught Samir. In for 4, out for 6. It helped and didn't. It brought temporary relief and a hollow aftertaste. One afternoon, during an anniversary gala meant to celebrate the palace's charitable work, Emily stood on a dais handing out awards. She smiled for cameras and accepted praise for her community service. The hall was full of the glitter of succession and the rustle of political choreography. Samir watched her from a seat in the front row, his expression proud. Rashid sat a few chairs away, his hand over his mouth in silent consideration. Halfway through the evening, Emily felt the oxygen thin. Her chest tightened and a buzzing sound swelled behind her ears.
She excused herself and tried to descend the dais steps, but a cluster of photographers moved in to preserve the moment of the consort exiting the stage. She felt suffocated by the attention, a thing that transformed being watched into an act of being owned. Her breath came faster. She clung to the banister, tasting metal and salt. Someone touched her elbow, Samir perhaps, or a staffer, and the hand was solid and real. "Breathe with me," a voice said, and she tried the old exercise. The room tilted like a ship. Images telescoped. Fatima's quiet concern, Rashid's watchful face, the baby's photograph on the wall. The cameras clicked. She stumbled into an anteroom, and there, out of the public eye, she had one of the worst panic attacks she had experienced since her early nights at the palace. Her body rebelled with a force that felt like a betrayal. She could not catch air. The attendants moved with clinical smoothness. Cold cloths, a fan,
measured reassurance. Samir bent over her, not with instructive tone, but with terrified love. "Stay with me," he said. "Please stay." She did not know if she stayed for him or if she stayed because survival is habitual. When the attack ebbed like a tide, leaving her raw and shaky, she lay there in silence and understood, in a way that had nothing to do with documents or protocols, that she had been slowly erased. The palace had been kind. It had been generous and healing. It had also been the mechanism by which she had been drawn away from the work that had once defined her. In the weeks that followed, Rashid proposed a solution that, to his mind, solved multiple problems. There was a coastal health initiative that required a director to temporarily oversee its opening. The locale was desirable, fresh sea air, fewer cameras, and the position was described as rest and oversight. He suggested Emily head the program on a provisional basis, citing the recent clinic controversies and the need for careful stewardship of their public works. "It will be good for you," he said, with the bland authority of someone who believed he was offering rescue. Samir, who loved her more plainly and desperately than the council would ever admit, supported the idea. "Some distance," he said. "For the press, for your peace, we can fund the program and you can direct it. It will be a way to keep your hand at work." He smiled, the way a man tries to make a cage look like a home. Fatima warned Emily privately. "Be careful," she whispered, her fingers folded around a cup of tea that had gone cold. "Distance can be a kindness or a removal. Ask for terms in writing. Keep your license active. Do not sign away authority." Emily, exhausted and in pieces, agreed to go. The seaside sounded like oxygen. Samir kissed her forehead and set a small bouquet of garden flowers on the bedside table, white petals arranged with an awkward tenderness, then left to attend a banquet.
She packed a small bag and kissed her child goodbye, leaving the infant in the care of the palace midwives for the first time. The farewell felt like a small betrayal and a rescue at once. The Coastal Initiative had everything a narrative required: a new clinic to open, a small team of workers eager for training, a population to benefit. Her initial months there were filled with genuine work: training midwives in basic obstetric triage, organizing outreach, teaching breathing techniques to laboring mothers. The work was the kind that fit into the long and lonely hours of practice, and for a time it felt like the Emily she had been had returned. She taught by day and slept with the sound of waves at night. The sea air cleared something from her lungs, and the work fed a deep hunger. But the escape was not an escape, it was a relocation. Rashid retained control over budgets and approvals. Requests for supplies had to be routed through palace channels, and funding transfers arrived sluggishly. Donors who had been willing to give based on her name asked for formalities. The program's autonomy was brittle. The palace wanted the public relations angle to be tight, and the council's oversight was a constant pressure that reattached on distant soil. Months into the project, a new set of regulations was proposed. The coastal program would be merged into the palace's charitable network under an umbrella organization with a board that stationed a palace-appointed treasurer in the director's office. The justification was mundane: compliance, transparency, sustainability, but the result was the same. Her authority was diluted. She was called director in name and liaison in operational practice. She tried to insist on her clinical autonomy. She drafted protocols, held training sessions, and negotiated with suppliers. Yet each refusal from the treasurer, each delay in equipment delivery, carried the quiet message: "You are not free to build here." The frustration aided her until it tasted like another kind of confinement. She would call Samir in the evenings to complain, and he would apologize, his voice thin with helplessness. "I will speak to them," he promised, his words a plea disguised as commitment. He did speak to them. His interventions often smoothed the path but rarely restored the independence she sought. The palace's structures had lodged into the bones of the program. It was hard to lift them free. The slow attrition continued until the final fracture. A donor withdrew funding under pressure from a political faction that had decided the palace's charity was being run within proper channels. The treasurer blamed Emily for poor fundraising strategy. In public, the palace framed the resourcing problem as a glitch. Privately, the treasurer recommended a pause to reassess leadership. It was the kind of administrative remove that reads to the press as benign, and in the hand of a palace's politics, works with lethal efficiency.
They asked her to step aside during the reassessment. She had been away from the capital for nearly a year. She returned expecting to defend the work she had built against the well-worn mechanisms of power. Instead, she was met by meetings and offices with paintings that made her feel small. The treasurer's language was precise. "For integrity, we invite you to allow the board to select an interim director." They framed it as a courtesy. Samir looked like he had been punched. Rashid's face was stoic as a stone in a stream. Fatima was quiet, her eyes wet with a hurt she could not name. Emily tried to stand. She presented budgets, attendance numbers, evidence of delivery. Dr. Kamal supported her.
A junior doctor testified to the trainings she had run. But administrative decisions are a different species of truth. They rely less on facts than on the authority that decides which facts get counted. The board had voted. The board had been advised. The treasurer had argued for the wisdom of a pause. She left the meeting in a quiet stupor. The halls were brighter than they used to be, as if the very light was unaware of the human cost of the decisions it illuminated. A small part of her, trained to triage, to problem solve, began to catalog steps forward. Paperwork, appeals, legal counsel. It was exhaustion rendered into process. But beyond process was a feeling that her life had been re-specified around the needs of a household that required her to be an emblem more than a practitioner. Her panic attacks came more often now. They arrived as sudden summers of cold in her limbs, as nausea, as a pressing that made speech a strain. She found herself avoiding public events, not because of motherly protectiveness, but because being on display had become a sort of consumption of self. At times she could name the source, the incremental diminutions, the institutional squeezes, but naming did not necessarily change structural power. The final scene of collapse happened not with sensationalism, but with a quiet inevitability. A televised panel, arranged by the Palace communications team, commissioned Emily to speak about maternal health, the very domain in which she had once built independent hope. She prepared a speech. She practiced breathing in the hotel green room. On camera, she spoke with clarity and warmth about community midwifery and the need for decentralized care. The host asked a direct question about autonomy and the NGO partnerships she had once championed. She answered candidly and briefly. Communities need their own voices. They need local leadership free from political interference. The line hung in the air like a splinter. The communications office had not cleared that phrasing. The Palace lawyers inhaled. The next morning, the council convened an emergency meeting.
Rashid, with his set jaw and measured fury, described the televised remark as misaligned with household messaging and argued for a protective measure to ensure consistent narratives in public domains. No one used the word punish. No one had to. They had a mechanism for protective measures, a period of monitored rest and reassignment to private counsel. It was phrased as concern. When Emily resisted, they called Dr. Kamal in, who, with weary professionalism, suggested that a period of structured rest might help manage her panic. He recommended a therapeutic retreat, a private health facility outside the public eye, where she could be monitored and receive care. He presented it as a medical necessity. She looked at Samir, who now stood between his brother's imperative and his wife's autonomy. "We must protect you," he said, "and the child." There was love in his eyes. There was also the fatigue of a man who had been buffeted by politics and did not know how to fight in other ways. Emily did not want to be an item his family sorted into a policy of protection. She wanted to be a clinician whose voice mattered. She wanted her life's work to stand. She wanted to be more than an emblem. But love makes a person heavy with gratitude. It can also make their aversion silent. Emily consented to the retreat because she believed, naively perhaps, that in a place designed for healing, she could rest and then return. She trusted in practitioners and the language of medicine. The retreat was not cruel. It was tasteful, discreet, and full of the soft amenities that buy silence. It was also a place where the public's vision of her could be turned into a thing kept behind glass. In the retreat, a succession of clinicians recommended slow work, cognitive therapies, pacing, breath work. They documented her panic attacks, suggested medication adjustments, and advised a gradual reintroduction to public life. For a while, the sessions helped. She learned breathing patterns to stabilize her autonomic nervous system. She journaled. She walked on salted paths. The sea air again eased a particular pain. Yet the longer she stayed, the more distant the world felt. Her phone calls were scheduled and monitored. The treasurer arranged monthly briefings. Samir visited sporadically and was increasingly occupied with governmental obligations. Moments of tenderness became buffered by the forms of institutions, the palace's need for a sanitized narrative that would not create ripples. The retreat's subtle pressure was that of time itself being used to reframe her. Weeks turned into months, months into a year. The child began school in the capital, and the daily images of shared breakfasts, once a source of joy, became a memory she could call up like a photograph. Her professional contacts, when they could reach her, received guarded replies. Some stopped calling.
The initial possibility of returning with renewed autonomy dissipated into a slow accommodation of being someone permanently framed by the palace's narrative. One afternoon, Dr. Kamal came to see her in a conference room with windows that looked like frames. He had a look of professional sorrow. "You have made progress," he said, "but re-entry must be managed." He slid a paper across the table, a long list of conditions for her return to practice, each clause more restrictive than the last. "It is standard," he said, and his voice carried the weight of someone who had learned to speak the language of containment as if it were kindness. Emily read the list. It stipulated that any public work outside of Palace channels required committee approval, that she would serve as an advisor under Palace auspices rather than an independent director, that her international travel would be conditional on board consent. It felt like a slow resignation, the legal translation of a life being repurposed for an institution's needs. She thought of the baby she had held, who was now almost old enough to ask questions about why their mother's office hours had shifted, and why she often spoke in the measured tones of someone who had been edited. She thought of a small clinic in a town she had grown up in, of the midwives who had learned to hold the line between life and death. She thought of the young woman who had once come for urgent care and had been sent away because of committee scheduling. These memories hurt because they were real and because they represented work she could no longer carry as she had once intended. The retreat's comfort could no longer cushion the sense of erasure. The realization crashed over her not with drama, but as a series of small, incontrovertible facts: lost conferences, proposed partnerships withdrawn, files closed. She felt bereft not because someone had taken her happiness, but because the structures around love had entailed a recalibration of self. Love, in this case, had been both balm and bind. In a private moment, alone at the window, where the sea marked a horizon line, she wrote a letter in her notebook. No one would read it except perhaps her own later eyes. She wrote of being a nurse, of wanting to be useful, of the moral calculus of small mercies. She wrote of the way being needed can be a currency that buys you into roles you would not choose. She wrote about Samir's gentleness and Rashid's fearful stewardship, about Fatima's loyalty and Dr. Kamal's professional sorrow. She wrote of how structures can translate care into containment. The letter was not a protest so much as a record of grief. It was a way to name what had changed in her. She folded it, slid it into a drawer, and did not mail it. Naming did not necessarily change institutions. At times, it only clarified the shape of sorrow. When she finally returned to the palace, it was under terms that resembled a partial reintegration. She was present at public events.
She led a session on breathing for new mothers that was photographed and shortly thereafter placed in glossy brochures. The images were calm. Behind the camera, however, she felt like a figure rendered for an audience that observed rather than engaged. The old hunger to save people by pressing hands to chests remained. She still triaged emergencies and counted breaths when needed. But the breadth of her agency, the decisions she could make, and the projects she could raise were now permanently narrowed. Years later, when a biographical piece was published by a writer who had once admired her clinical work, the piece described a woman who had left the margins of humanitarian practice to enter an intimate closeness with a royal. The article praised what it called sacrificial love and suggested that some things, family, lineage, public narrative, require one to reframe priorities. The piece did not mention the details of administrative downgrading or the days of canceled outreach. It did not speak of the clinic's paused projects or of the political currents that had made certain donors wary. Emily read it and felt a small, enduring ache. She had been saved in one arena and diminished in another. The ego's quiet tally of losses versus gains performed a cruelty in her chest. She had given breath to a man who had been drowning, and in doing so she had gradually stopped being the kind of rescuer who could show up anywhere at any time and change the fate of a life. The paradox remained. The very love that had brought him back to the world was the mechanism through which her own professional identity had been diminished. In the end, her destruction was not sudden nor absolute. It was a profoundly human outcome of choices nested inside power. She was not ruined as in broken beyond repair. She was changed, reconfigured, partially erased in the professional and personal ways that mattered most to her. She had a child who loved her, a husband who adored her, a household that protected her in certain ways. But she had far less of the freedom she had once taken for granted. The clinic she had dreamed of remained an emblem in a corner file, a plan never fully executed, a life's work deferred.
Samir loved her with a devotion that sometimes felt closer to worship than partnership, and his gratitude was not selfish. He mourned, too, the compromises he had agreed to because they served the palace. Rashid's sternness was founded on fear of scandal, fear of instability, and that fear had shaped many decisions that had closed doors rather than opened them. Fatima remained faithful in ways that looked like both rescue and indictment. She often brought Emily small gifts and once left a vase of pruned roses on her desk with a note. Beauty kept is not always living. In quiet moments, Emily would walk the marble corridors and press a hand to the cool stone, feeling the echo of the person she had been.
She would sit in the little clinic room on palace grounds and run her hands over supplies, teaching a junior nurse the correct angle for sutures and the patience required for long shifts. She did this work with tenderness and competence, and it preserved a part of her that deserved preservation. But sometimes after the doors closed and the staff left, she would sit alone, hold the small silk handkerchief Fatima had given her, and remember the first time she had taught a man to breathe and not known she would be the one to lose herself for the grace of that breath. If there is a moral in this arc, it is not a tidy sentence. The story resists easy summation. It asks a harder question. Can love be saving for some and costly for others without either party being morally culpable in a simple way? The palace's politics were not a plot device for cruelty, as much as a system that absorbed generosity and repackaged it for a public hungry for images of restoration. The age gap mattered because it introduced asymmetry, emotional magnetism plus institutional advantage. Samir's wealth and status meant his need could be satisfied in ways that transformed Emily's obligations into constraints. Rashid's fear and the council's risk aversion worked like tide to pull at the shore of her autonomy. Love, which had the power to rebuild a man, carried with it a weight the lightness of first affection did not reveal. Years later, visitors who came to the palace remarked on Emily's kindness and composure. She was still quick with a practical joke, still gentle in an emergency, still teaching someone to breathe. But like many stories of slow erosion, the loss was not always visible from the outside. Inside, she carried a sense of dislocation, an ache that sometimes rose at night and left her insomniac. At times, she would look at photographs from her old life, smudged Polaroids of ER bays and colleagues, and feel both tenderness and mourning for the person shaped by a different set of obligations. At the end, sitting by a small window that framed the palace gardens, she cupped a cooling cup of mint tea. The steam mapped a slow ring on the marble, a faint circle like the one she had watched years earlier. She inhaled and counted her breath, not for clinical intervention, not for a patient who could not remember how, but for herself. In, 4, out, 6. The practice steadied her for the pay's duties, affection for a child, care for a man she loved, the small ministrations that a household required. There was love enough in those acts to be real, and there was loss enough to be devastating in its own quieter way. She had stepped into a world that promised to heal another, and the cost of that healing was a remaking of her life in the shadow of a household's need. The age gap was not a villain by itself. It was the hinge on which power and expectation turned. It made intimacy asymmetrical in a way that allowed structural forces to use love as a lever.
She had come to heal him. She had done so with courage, skill, and tenderness. The man she had cared for was better. He breathed, he laughed, his life had more shape. But the question that sat at the center of her life was the one the title had posed. Was this love an act of saving, or an escape into a shape that cost her what mattered most? The answer was both. The love saved a life. It also became the scaffolding that permitted the palace to repurpose a healer into an emblem. Whether that reconfiguration was worth it was a question without a clean verdict. In the end, the story that remained was not a moral condemnation of a man or a system, but a sobering record of how affection and institutions can conspire to remake a life. Emily stayed, loved, and lost. She gave breath to another, and by doing so, surrendered pieces of herself in ways that were not malicious, but were deeply consequential. The palace had been a place of healing, and also a place where care could be converted into constraint. She continued to breathe. She continued to show up. She continued to teach. And when she closed her hand around a small white flower from the garden, she felt both the soft memory of bloom and the brittle aftertaste of preservation. The petals, pressed between her fingers, were both beautiful and fragile, the sum of a life that had been given to love, and in the giving had been quietly redefined. If the question lingers in the reader's mind, love or escape, it is because the story is not meant to simplify. It is a testament to the complexity of human attachments, the way power amplifies age gaps into structural forces,
and the way love can, in saving one life, quietly unmoor another. Your answer may vary. For Emily, the ledger balanced with wins and irreplaceable losses, the echoes of breath and tea and flowers marking both the tender and the tragic. If you could ask her, perhaps she would say, "I breathed life back into him. I lost a version of myself in the process. And I do not regret the tenderness. I only wish the world had offered another way." If this story moved you, share your thoughts and tell us, would you have stayed? If you want more stories like this, subscribe and share this video with someone who might feel this tension in their own life.